You and your friends are dead. On today's episode of Playing with Fear. Welcome to JoBlo Horror Videos Playing with Fear, where we take a look at some of the landmark horror titles throughout the history of gaming. Today's pick is a bit of a controversial one for a couple reasons. Friday the 13th for the NES is an often hated entry into the 8-bit horror landscape. Part of this perception is that it was published by the Rainbow of Death, LJN. And part of it is that Friday is a difficult and surprisingly complex game that was not explained very well and doesn't have the best learning curve while you are playing it. Friday the 13th is an oft-forgotten, Emmy-nominated TV series that aired from 1987 to 1990 and follows the owners of an antique shop as they hunt down cursed artifacts. The video game, however, you play as one of 6 camp counselors. Oh, okay, yeah, that makes way more sense. Friday the 13th is, of course, the legendary slasher series that began in 1980 with 9 solo entries, a remake, and a matchup that had horror fans drooling all over the world. The franchise would also bleed into toys, comics, an interesting TV show, novels, and of course, video games. Much like our previous entry Alien and its slasher contemporaries Halloween and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th got its digital start on the microcomputers with 1986's Friday the 13th, the computer game. Unlike those two slasher series with their Atari games that went after the plots of the very first films of the franchise, Friday went all in on a more advanced Jason. To be fair, this was due to the abilities of game programmers by 1986, as well as the amount of Friday films they had available to take from. Also, to be fair, saying advanced is being kind. There isn't much to the gameplay. You play as one of 5 camp counselors protecting the others from imminent Jason death. There are only 5 levels, and they all look a little samey being within the same campground. Still, the graphics were nice and detailed for the time, and Jason will even disguise himself as he goes around murdering, which is as frustrating as it is an interesting game mechanic. Enter LJN, the rainbow seal of death for 8 and 16-bit video games. Or at least that's what's become ingrained in our brains. LJN published many, many bad games, but they weren't the developers of those bad games. Friday the 13th for the NES, in fact, was developed by Atlas, and actually isn't that bad. Okay, well, it's not terrible. If Atlas sounds familiar, that's because they went on to become the creator of the insanely long and wildly popular Shin Megami Tensei series, as well as the equally critically acclaimed Persona series of games. Now, I doubt the same ragtag group of people worked on Friday the 13th, only the company's third game were the ones who went on to be involved in those games, but the studio is no slouch. By 1989, the Friday the 13th series had produced 8 films with a load of characters and Jason styles to choose from. Also by 1989, the NES had seen its fair share of licensed products, although few from the realm of horror. LJN began to snatch up rights to many movie licenses and wanted to push out as many as possible with the idea that consumers would see a movie or show they liked and rush to purchase the video game equivalent. Oh, how we were lied to. Friday the 13th was only their 3rd title, but neither Jaws nor The Karate Kid inspired much confidence in their ability to turn things around. Even well after Friday the 13th, the trail of bad game sadness continued with Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, X-Men, the list goes on. They didn't even limit themselves to the NES, with ventures on both the Game Boy and Super Nintendo to follow for the better part of a decade. If I seem to be picking on LJN, it's because they make it so easy. In all honesty though, they had some honest-to-God gems in their collection, and even today's game is much more than just the joke it has become. The other reason is there really isn't much online about the actual development of the game, with only composer Hirohiko Takayama getting a credit. He does a good job here on both music and sound effects. And he had a short but productive video game career with games like Ghostbusters 2 on the Game Boy and Adventure Island 3 on the NES. It's your typical summer at good old reliable Camp Crystal Lake. The sun is shining, the kids are enjoying their camp games, the existential dread of an invincible zombie killing machine that could be around every corner creep into the back of your mind. You and your other 5 camp counselor buddies are tasked with not only keeping at least one of these damn kids alive, but making sure at least one of you survives the gauntlet of zombies, wolves, crows, an angry, ethereal, decapitated mommy head, and one lightning-quick, pissed-off mama's boy. Merely surviving is not an option, as Jason will win this game of attrition, as he can come back to life while you and your friends, not to mention your young wards, have only one life to live. You need to take the fight to Jason and his mom to end their terror. And that's it. Really, that isn't much thinner than any of the films that the game draws inspiration from, minus the gore and nudity, of course. Most of the film's stories are teens getting drunk, high, and fornicating, followed by their ever more interesting and grim demise. Rinse and repeat. This brevity is also pretty standard for the time, besides video game RPGs that built the entire reputations over long story elements. Most games had a basic story and easy to understand mechanics to make them more accessible. Well, 1 out of 2 ain't bad. The story being thin definitely works in the game's favor though, as game mechanics are complicated enough, something that will be made quite clear in the next section. Alright, the other thing besides the shock of this game actually existing on the Nintendo in the late 80s that make Friday the 13th stand out is its gameplay, both good and bad. So when you hit start, you get to pick one of the 6 camp counselors, which, if I'm being honest, look like perfect 80s victims and even share some of the names of characters throughout the films of the franchise. Once you select your character, you start in whatever cabin that character you choose inhabits. From there you will have one of 3 views. The traveling view shows your character walking on the trail of cabins outside. The second view is the map, and the third is your player inside of a cabin. Sadly, this is where some of the difficulty and confusion begins. It is exceedingly difficult to tell where the hell you are going in your first playthrough. You can't even tell what direction you're going unless you walk for a bit, stop, check the map, and then walk again to see which direction you're headed. Now, I had this game growing up. We may have had it new, but I don't remember, and we certainly didn't have the instruction manual anymore. Without that, there was virtually no way to tell what you were supposed to do. There are zombies everywhere, bats, wolves, and crows will come at you as fast as any of the Ninja Gaiden games, and without warning, you could get attacked by Jason. Walking on the trail or in the forest, boom, Jason attack. Putzing around in one of the cabins, boom, Jason attack. In a boat trying to get to one of the cabins in the lake, boom, shark Jason attack. What you are supposed to do is use the counselors to fight your way through the zombies and defeat Jason 3 times. The game designates each of these as days, so each time you defeat him, you'll get what I'll charitably call a cutscene. The best way to do this is to find upgrades to your weapon. Every character starts with literal rocks to throw at the enemies. As expected, these rocks don't do much against anyone, especially Jason. The manual alludes to what you need to do, but after killing a set number of zombies, you can find a throwing knife. From there, you upgrade to the machete by doing the same thing, only a lot more of it. While you only need to kill 5 zombies with rocks to get the knife, not a sentence I thought I'd ever have to say, to get the machete, you have to kill a whopping 60 zombies, all with the same character, and do it over and over again to upgrade each one. Other weapons you can get are the axe, the torch, and the pitchfork. The axe and the torch can be found in locked cabins or by lighting all the fireplaces inside of them respectively. The pitchfork, which is also the most powerful weapon in the game, can only be found by defeating the floating head of Jason's mom on day 3. A completely optional fight, and one that you can do on each of the 3 days that also nets you some pretty awesome items, is wandering into the cave and fighting Pamela Voorhees, or at least what's left of her. She is the only other boss character, but unlike her son, killing her doesn't end the day and is not required to complete the game. In addition to weapons, the characters can find items strewn throughout the camp world. These are lighters that are needed to light fireplaces inside the cabins, notes that will give you hints on what to do and where to go, keys which are used to unlock doors in the cabins that are hidden within the forest or the caves, and vitamins which will give you back some health or act as an emergency Hail Mary if all of your life runs out. There are also 2 special items, the flashlight, which you can obtain by lighting every fireplace in the large cabins, and the disgusting sweater worn by Mrs. Voorhees, which acts as armor of all things. Now, show of hands, how many people watching this video knew this game had this many aspects to it?
Come on, raise your hands. Let's see them.
Just as each weapon has different power levels, each counselor is different in ways that go beyond just cosmetic. Each player character has different metrics in running speed, jumping height, throwing ability, and rowing ability. Each counselor is dependent on the player upgrading their weapons and finding items, so you probably will want to make sure everyone has more than just rocks to fight Jason with, although I'd love to see that in one of the movies. If all the counselors die, then that's it. If Jason gets to the children and kills them all, that's it. You are treated to one of the most definitive and soul-crushing endings of all time. A black screen with the words, "You and your friends are dead. Game over." So kill Jason 3 times. That can't be that hard, right? Right? Well, unfortunately, you were in the hole early on this one. All of those strategies and ways to find new weapons and what to do, none of that is explained unless you have the manual, and even then, a lot of it's left out. You will have no idea where to go, how to upgrade weapons, or that going after Mom will help you immeasurably. On top of that, the controls are laggy, your first weapon is underpowered and can only be thrown in an arc, and each time you fight Jason he gets faster and is harder to kill. He also doesn't stand by idly waiting for you. He brings the fight to you more often than not, or will lure you to him by going after a peer, or worse, the kids. Just like last episode, we have to look at what this game is versus what this game was. This 8-bit game is not scary now, but in 1989, to the audience it was sold to, that certainly got the job done. The cover shows Jason wielding an axe from Friday the 13th Part 7, and is just bizarre. Not only did Nintendo okay a video game based on a severely R-rated film series, but they greenlit the cover having a picture from one of those very films. It can also be scary to face Jason, particularly in the side-scrolling sections, as he can come out of nowhere, and you get hit with a stinger of music or a complete stoppage of screen movement. Where the scares really take center stage, though, are in the presentation. The music on the main trails is fine, but becomes haunting and just plain fear-inducing when you enter the cabins. It almost creates a sense that someone is watching you, stalking you, and then when you do finally run into Jason, the music becomes high-tempo and tries something completely different. The actual fighting is much more akin to Punch-Out, but the attempt is sincere. When Jason decides to go after another camp counselor or the children, it becomes a drop-what-you're-doing race to stop him. While this might feel like an annoying game mechanic, it is quite good at building tension. When you get to them and they thank you for saving their lives, you turn each corner of the house, the screen changes. You know he's there waiting for you. It's good stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of this game's creative ideas and game mechanics are buried by poor execution and a terrible reputation. Friday the 13th is almost never remembered fondly, and in fact is far more popular for being made fun of than for being an early example of horror on the NES. A positive shine to its legacy is that it laid the groundwork for another LJN-published misunderstood horror title in 1990's A Nightmare on Elm Street. And the 8-bit version of Jason here has become sort of a fan favorite. It received the physical action figure treatment from NECA in 2015 and became an unlockable skin in the much truer to the film franchise game Friday the 13th, released by Gun Media in 2017. Since his appearance here, Jason has only appeared in 2 future releases. As a DLC character in Mortal Kombat X, and lovingly preserved in the 2017 release that came out for all major systems of the time. The main reason for this is almost certainly due to the legal battles that not only ended the most recent game's updates early, but also made it almost impossible to get all the films together in one collection before Scream Factory worked their magic this past year. If you have a chance, play the most recent game, as it gives you the best possible experience to play as Jason that we will ever have. If you want to check out the 89 original, then I strongly suggest you seek out a guide or even play one of the many fan mods that are designed to make the game a little easier. Were you able to beat this game when it came out? What did you think of this and the 2017 release? Let us know in the comments, as well as what other games you'd like to see from this show.
Today we're looking at what is a fairly obvious choice for a game adaptation, with the only oddity being that it was released so late into the series' life. Saw took audiences and theater chains by storm in late October of 2004, and the licensed game Saw would get released in October of 2009. That would end up being just a few short weeks before the 6th installment of the film series. It's pretty much exactly what you'd think it would be, but how does it fare as a game and compared to the series of horror movies it's based on?
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive, but not you. Not anymore.
James Wan and Leigh Whannell would have a mega hit on their hands when Saw was released on October 29, 2004. I was personally blown away at 19, leaving the theater wanting more and trying to comprehend what I'd just seen, as it was different than anything I'd ever seen before in my life. 2 years later, Hostel would come out and ramp up the gore, but lose some of the cerebral aspects of Saw. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy Hostel as well, but Saw is a whole different animal. The independent movie that could would also be the new yearly Halloween tradition. In a cinematic world of straight-to-video sequels or flat-out stagnation in horror franchises, Saw would crank out films nearly every year for a good while. While the critical praise would never match the first film, every entry made more than enough money to justify moving forward with a sequel. The first 7 would be released every October from 2004 to 2010, with a few more coming in 2017, 2021, and the 10th coming up in 2023. In addition to every single one being released theatrically, getting to 10 movies in a horror series is quite the accomplishment. In addition to making careers for James Wan and Leigh Whannell, who would go on to give us some really great stuff, Saw was very popular, and when a franchise is popular, it gets both stuff and things. Merchandise would flow with toys, apparel, decorations, and it would lend itself wonderfully to mazes at Universal Studios' Halloween Horror Nights. While there are shockingly no comic books or novels based on the property, the allure of a video game being just too much, and with horror games being incredibly popular, the world of Saw would be transported to the 7th generation of consoles.
Let the game begin.
As the 3rd movie was approaching release, we would get our first announcement for a game for the franchise, with the idea of releasing it concurrently with the already announced 4th film. BRASH Entertainment was the studio that was going to develop and release the game with the help of Twisted Pictures, the studio in charge of all the movies. BRASH is an interesting choice, as they'd only done kids games up to that point, like Alvin and the Chipmunks and Space Chimps for the PS2. BRASH would struggle to stay above water though, and the game would be passed to Zombie Studios. And even though that's a great horror name for a game studio, they made their name with the Spec Ops games from the late 90s to early 2000s. Since Lionsgate wasn't in the games business, they decided they needed a publisher as well, and this time they chose a heavy hitter. Konami stepped in, and this would probably make most horror fan games jump for joy, as the studio was the owner of the famous Silent Hill series, which is indisputably on the Mount Rushmore of horror game series. Saw would release on October 9th, 2009 for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, much closer to Saw 6's release, with a PC port coming October 22nd, just a day before the movie premiere. The game opens up with Detective David Tapp waking up in Whitehurst Asylum with the popular reverse bear trap attached to his head. Tapp is Danny Glover's character from the first film, who has clearly survived somehow, and the story takes place between the first and second films. Tapp gets out of the trap after watching a video from everyone's favorite puppet Billy. Well, it's voiced by series villain Jigsaw, but Billy is sort of the mascot, along with Pighead. We'll see Pighead later too. Tapp escapes his room by finding the combination to the door lock written on the bathroom stalls. Tapp starts running into people and quickly realizes that he is not alone in the asylum. He has his own game to play to escape, but he's also a central figure in everyone else's game, as inside his body is the only key to escape this nightmare. David goes through the asylum, avoiding traps both obvious with glass on the ground for his bare feet and hidden like shotgun traps attached to the doors, syringes in toilets, and acid in barrels, along with some other franchise staples. Tapp's game involves saving a few select hostages while fighting his way through the maze, avoiding traps and other victims, and solving puzzles. The first of his victims to save is Amanda, who we all know as someone who survived her game and later becomes an apprentice for Jigsaw. While searching around the asylum, David will find notes about the asylum as well as notes from Jigsaw about what's going on. After a brief time with Amanda, she's taken away by Pigmask, and Tapp has to push on before he too is taken to another location. He wakes up in another part of the asylum, this time with an exploding collar that will react and blow up in close contact with others wearing theirs. The next person that is part of David's game is Jennings Foster, who he finds stuck in a pendulum-type trap. Jennings is freed and flees to try to find a way out of the building, and if the name is familiar, it's because he's another detective from the films that apparently killed a man in a hit and run and framed another guy for it, which is kind of why he ended up part of the game. David makes his way through a ton more traps and finds various weapons to use, including a gun. He eventually runs into Melissa Singh, the wife of his partner that died chasing Jigsaw in the first film, and saves her from another nasty trap. Despite being saved, Melissa still hates David as she blames him for her husband's death. She leaves and locks David in another wing of the hospital. Tapp next finds Oswald McGillicuddy, which is the actual name they used, I assure you, a reporter who has followed Jigsaw's crimes but who Jigsaw feels didn't understand or report the message properly and needs to be in the game. Tapp saves him from a trap setup, but he's killed quickly after tripping a trap ahead of Tapp, and now I'm done being Dr. Seuss for a while. David continues to move through the asylum until he finds Obi Tate, who actually put out a request in the papers to be tested by Jigsaw. David sets him free, but Tate's angry he couldn't do it himself and runs off. The final victim is Jeff Riedenauer, who was previously saved by Tapp and Singh from a trap. Tapp is successful and then has to fight and kill Pighead to escape. Finally, Tapp is presented with two choices, a door marked Truth and a door marked Freedom. Choosing Freedom lets you out of the maze and the game ends, but David is so distraught at you not finding the answers that he takes his own life. Choosing Truth leads you to fighting Jigsaw, who you eventually defeat, only to find out that it's Melissa Singh finishing her game. She stumbles to her feet and walks directly into another shotgun death trap, dying exactly as her husband did. This is too much for Tapp to take, again, and this time he ends up in an active asylum. No happy ending here, regardless of what door you take. For the record, the canonical ending is freedom, though you wouldn't find that out until the game's sequel.
He doesn't want us to cut through our chains. He wants us to cut through our feet.
The game tries to be a typical survival horror of the time. You go from room to room and section to section, doing some sort of cycle involving fighting enemies, solving puzzles, and finding key items to use. The puzzles could be as simple as reaching into something gross or painful to find something needed, or reconfiguring a power grid, or, when they ran out of ideas, one of those dumb picture puzzles where you have to slide the sections around to put together the picture properly. Unfortunately, the entire game looks pretty much the same wherever you go, with the exception of your brief stint outside, and all the puzzles just start repeating themselves, just getting larger in scale. Combat is usually a one-on-one with handheld weapons, and eventually firearms, but the close combat is pretty rough in both looks and execution. Firearms do the trick best, but you can also scavenge for parts and build your own traps to set that, frankly, don't work the way you want them to in-game. All of the enemies fight the same, but do look different based on what part of the game you're in and what traps they have associated with them. The only exception to this is fighting the only boss of the game with Pighead, and even then they just look slightly different than the others and have a larger health pool. With the game being released in 2009, it looked like a lot of other third-person titles, and the graphics don't really hold up compared to today or the lovingly crafted 8 and 16-bit games of the past. Health items can be picked up to save for later or used immediately depending on if they're bandages or health hypos. You start the game with a lighter to see in the dark, and that can eventually be upgraded to a flashlight, which is easier to use and lets you see more. The random notes you can find would have been cool if they were personalized, but they all read in the same lame-looking pop-up box when you find them. While the characters sometimes exist from the previous films, only Tobin Bell lends his voice to the cast returning as Jigsaw, and he sounds about like he does in the rest of the series. Earl Alexander plays Tap, and he would have small roles in the far superior Suffering games from a few years prior, while Cortana herself, Jen Taylor, lends her voice as Amanda. It's cool and they do a good job, but it would have been more fun if they could have secured the original actors, or, if Tap looked anything like Danny Glover. All in all, it's an inferior survival horror game that could have been great with the license it had and Konami producing it.
Those who don't appreciate life do not deserve life.
This game should have been scary, but then I guess the movies aren't really scary either. They have lots of tense moments and some jump scares, but don't really have an overall scary tone. In that sense, the game succeeds at mimicking the movies, as there are certainly jump scares from both enemies and traps, and there's tension trying to figure out the solutions of the puzzles the game presents. Unfortunately, with the stagnant number of puzzles available, this quickly wears thin and is completely lost with secondary playthroughs. Maybe played with the lights off and the sound turned up, you can get some scares out of it, but it's often too frustrating in gameplay elements to give proper fright. While I can't find sales records for the game, it must have done well enough to get a sequel, with Saw: Flesh and Blood being released just a year later from Konami and Zombie again. Both games had mediocre reviews, although seem to have cult followings nowadays. Unfortunately, both games have been removed from digital stores and they aren't exactly cheap to buy physically. I'd say seek them out if you're a die-hard Saw or die-hard survival horror fan only. With over a decade since the last release, would you like to see a new game with the new movie? Have you played either of these games? Let us know in the comments.
Sorry, we're closed.
Well, that's all for JoBlo Horror Originals Playing with Fear. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you on some of our other shows.
Today we jump back to visit two of our old pals with the Nintendo Entertainment System and publisher LJN. We are taking a look at 1990's A Nightmare on Elm Street, the sister release of Friday the 13th, released just a year before. And you know what? Just like that game, this one will surprise you. A Nightmare on Elm Street is the brainchild of master of horror Wes Craven. Craven came up with the idea from a mixture of ideas from real life. He read articles from the 70s about refugees fleeing war and genocide in Cambodia and Vietnam who suffered incredibly disturbing nightmares, and some of them even dying during their sleep. It was attributed to sudden unexplained death syndrome, or Brugada syndrome, which is abnormal rhythms in the heart that can cause a heart attack. The thought of nightmares literally killing you was one thing, but he wanted to go deeper. What was in these nightmares? Craven remembered back further to his own childhood, when he was frightened by an elderly man outside his home one night. 5 years after the glut of slasher films began, A Nightmare on Elm Street was released and instantly gave us something different. It made $57 million on a sub-$2 million budget and was insanely popular. The studio New Line would even consider the bulk of their success attributed to the film and character claiming to be the house that Freddy built. It would receive 6 solo sequels, a crossover with his hockey mask counterpart, a short-lived TV series, which you can learn more on in our episode about it in Horror TV Shows We Miss, while also appearing in comics, novels, toys, other assorted merchandise, and of course, video games. Now I said of course video games, but the film franchise only received 2, both of them in the span of 2 years no less. 1989 would give us A Nightmare on Elm Street for the Commodore 64 and IBM computer from Monarch Studio, and 1990 would give us, well, Nightmare on Elm Street for the Nintendo Entertainment System, developed by Rare and published by LJN. A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1989 is super interesting, and I honestly had no idea it existed before doing the research for this video. To be fair though, most of the internet is on the same page there, as it's hard to find really anything at all. The game opens with you picking one of 6 heroes from the third film in the franchise. Yeah, this game takes the characters and story, term used very loosely here, from the third and fourth films, as they were the 2 most recent during development. Once you select your main character, you are thrust into a top-down bird's-eye view of your character running around to find Freddy's house, while avoiding a huge version of the Dream Killer himself. Once you enter, your job is to continually traverse downward into the house while fighting enemies and collecting items along the way. The aesthetic is Chip's challenge getting stuck in a Freddy Krueger nightmare. Where Freddy's house is at the beginning of the game, as well as what floor your friends are on and where on the floor they're trapped, is procedurally generated, so you get a little replay value there, but the game can be a difficult slog. There is no music, and although the presentation on the IBM version is crisp for the time, the Commodore 60 version isn't pretty. The game gets virtually no love or coverage, but it's worth looking into and is considered abandonware now, i.e. free to download. Be careful though, you need the manual too, as it's an old school copy protected game. The next year, Rare, yeah, that Rare, the British powerhouse that gave us Battletoads, Donkey Kong Country, and GoldenEye, would develop A Nightmare on Elm Street to be distributed by LJN. The original concept of this game was just wild. It was pitched that the player would control Freddy and kill off the teenagers trying to bury his bones to be rid of him. Nintendo kind of takes umbrage at religious imagery, sex or nudity, and child murder. The game was released in October, of 1990 for the Nintendo Entertainment System to not great reviews. However, now 30 years later, it's starting to be looked at a little more kindly. Collect Freddy's bones and burn them. Next section. Okay, it's slightly more than that, but really not by much. You play as an unnamed teenager of the titular Elm Street on a quest to find all of Freddy Krueger's bones and burn them to ash, forever stopping his reign of terror. You need to stay awake while you visit various houses on the street, as well as the junkyard and the high school. Pretty marquee landmarks throughout the run of the series' biggest films. That's honestly it. Most of the rest of what goes on will be covered in the gameplay section. And here we are. At its heart, A Nightmare on Elm Street is a collectathon platformer. You play as one of the teenagers being stalked by Freddy on Elm Street, and your goal is to collect his bones from every single stage until you defeat him and burn his bones to ash. You start on the famous street and pick one of the houses. The houses are switched around on the order that you enter them with every playthrough, but the levels themselves never change. On the street and in each house are enemies trying to stop you. Shamblers, Skellos, Deathwings, Night Prowlers, Hounds, and Boggles all try to stop you. My amazing editor is doing his stuff to show you that these are actually non-copyright infringing bats, dogs, zombies, skeletons, and whatever the hell a boggle is. These creatures aren't the only things out to get you, as time itself is your enemy. As bad as all these things are while you're awake, they pull a Castlevania 2 and have a terrible night for a curse. As the level ticks on, you can find cups of coffee on the ground to keep you awake. If you stop moving for too long or go too long without coffee, you'll fall asleep. In the dream world, the levels retain the same architecture, but the color schemes change, and the enemy skins are different in addition to them being stronger against your attacks, and with their attacks being stronger against you. It's not all to their benefit, however, as in the dream world you can take advantage of certain powers. The Acrobat, Necromancer, and Shadow Dancer all elevate the player in different ways. When you are in the waking world, your player avatar just kinda looks like an extra from Saved by the Bell. His jump is good but feels unwieldy, and his only means of attack is to punch everything that comes his way. In the dream world though, you can switch between the three powers by hitting select. The Acrobat can do a roll jump and throw a javelin, the Necromancer has a Princess Peach-like jump glide and launches a fireball-like attack, and the Shadow Dancer can throw a ninja star as well as do an aimed jump kick. You aren't granted these powers automatically, you do need to pick up the item boxes when you're in the dream world to use them. It's also a cool nod to the third movie, where the teens can kind of pick their own powers. The trade-off is of course that the enemies are tougher in the dream world. But you do have more than just a hand-to-hand combat. There's one more thing to watch out for, however. Freddy can stalk you in the dream world. The longer you stay asleep, the more likely you are to get attacked by Freddy. The level music, which is composed by David Wise and is great by the way, suddenly shifts to an 8-bit version of the series' famous nursery rhyme. And then it's only a matter of time until you have to face off with the Springwood Slasher. Once defeated, you can get back to his bones on the various levels. The three houses, the junkyard, the cemetery, Freddy's house, and finally the school. At the end of each stage, once you've collected the requisite number of bones, you fight a Freddy boss variant. These bosses include a razor claw hand, a Freddy head reminiscent of the snake creature from Part 3, a flying razor claw, a Freddy bat, a Freddy ghost, and a head razor claw combination. The only optional boss fights are the ones where Freddy comes for you in the dream world. You can completely avoid these by either collecting all the bones that open up the exit and boss fight, or by finding a boombox to wake you up, because of course that's what does it. It's all pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it, and you can have multiple strategies for each stage. The final one is long and difficult, culminating in a boss rush mode as you face off against Krueger one final time. The unfortunate part here is that he is the exact same model and fight style as the optional mid-stage boss fights. Beat him and burn his bones down to ashes to complete the game. The final thing of note, and it's an interesting one, is that this game is 4-player compatible right off the bat. Just plug in 4 controllers into a multi-tap and you can have a spooky 8-bit nightmare fest. Well, the question we've come to ask at the end of all these videos is, say it with me, is the game scary? Like many of the games from this time, no, it's not. But also, like most of its horror contemporaries, it certainly could have been at the right age or frame of mind. The opening screen may look silly, but for a Nintendo game in the earliest of the early 90s, it's done well and kinda freaky. The music here fits the game like a razor blade glove, and in some instances adds genuine dread. When the music changes in the dream world from the fast-paced action tune to the simple nursery rhyme, you feel the need to hurry the hell up. The screen turns black and you get blood-red letters exclaiming that Freddy is here, which can be a bit palm sweat-inducing. The rest of the game has a generally fun and spooky tone and atmosphere, but overall just doesn't stand the test of time in terms of fright. The game's legacy is mostly tied to the label of being a bad game. Obviously, it can be obtuse in parts and difficult, sure, but I think the people that are rediscovering it now, much later, agree that it's a solid game for the most part. It's ripe for satire with its graphics, controls, and difficulty spike, but playing it more, I would even say that it's better than the Friday the 13th sister game on the same console, and that's the one I had as a kid and really enjoyed.
Please, God.
This is God.
Freddy Krueger as a character has certainly infiltrated the pop culture zeitgeist like few others, but in terms of video games, one of the biggest media spaces of all, he's been awfully quiet. Apart from this game and the still grossly underdiscussed IBM and Commodore 64 title from the year prior, Freddy has only been a guest character in Mortal Kombat 9 and the horror icon showcase game Dead by Daylight. Part of this is almost certainly because the series has been dormant since the much maligned remake, and the only other appearance from the bastard son of 1,000 maniacs was on an episode of The Goldbergs. Hopefully the rights owners can figure out what to do on screen and in video game form. Also hopefully while Robert Englund still wants to help out with the character. NECA, purveyor of all things cool horror toys, did put out a GameStop exclusive Freddy figure based on the game, but other than that, this title lives in that nebulous space that ignored ROMs Go to Die. Did you play this one when it came out? Do you prefer this one or Jason's 8-bit outing? What do you want to see in a Nightmare on Elm Street game in the future if we get one? Let us know in the comments.